When a system stops working, people do not panic. That idea is comforting, dramatic, and completely wrong. People imagine collapse as chaos, as noise, as sudden explosions in daily life. They imagine lines, riots, screaming headlines, instant breakdown. But real systems do not fail like that. They fail quietly. They fail in ways that feel reasonable at first. They fail in ways that allow people to keep going. And that is exactly why they last as long as they do. When a system stops working, the first thing people do is not resist it. They try to make it work anyway. Because admitting a system is broken is not just frightening, it is destabilizing. It forces people to confront something much deeper than the future. It forces them to question the past. It forces them to wonder whether the effort they invested, the sacrifices they made, and the rules they followed were ever aligned with reality at all. And that realization is unbearable for most people. So instead of questioning the system, they question themselves. They assume they are the problem. They assume they need to work harder, try smarter, be more flexible. This is the first and most important reaction. Denial, not denial in the dramatic sense, but denial in the practical sense. Denial that allows daily life to continue. People tell themselves things like, this is temporary. This always happens. This has happened before. They'll fix it. These thoughts are not lies. They are coping mechanisms. They allow people to keep waking up, keep working, keep participating. And systems depend on that participation. Denial is not weakness. It is survival. And broken systems are built to exploit it. As long as denial holds, the system holds. Because denial buys time. And time is the most valuable resource any failing system has. When denial begins to crack, people don't revolt. They adapt. Adaptation is the most misunderstood phase of systemic failure. From the outside, it looks like strength. It looks like resilience. It looks like responsibility. People take on more work, more hours, more stress. They adjust budgets. They cut corners. They delay plans. They sacrifice rest. They sacrifice comfort. They sacrifice the future. And they tell themselves this is what adulthood looks like. This is what maturity looks like. This is what resilience looks like. But adaptation is not resilience. It is absorption. People absorb the damage so the system doesn't have to. Every time people stretch themselves to survive inside a broken system, the system learns that it does not need to change. This is why broken systems persist, because people compensate for them. The system stops delivering stability, so people provide their own. The system stops rewarding effort, so people work twice as hard. The system stops protecting the future, so people gamble on the present. From the outside, it looks functional. From the inside, it is exhausting. This is the moment when the system quietly shifts its burden from structure to people. And once that shift happens, reversing it becomes almost impossible. Because the system is no longer failing visibly, it is failing internally. Inside households, inside relationships, inside bodies, inside minds. Adaptation deepens dependency. The more people adapt, the harder it becomes to leave. Because leaving would mean abandoning all the adjustments they've made, all the sacrifices, all the rationalizations. At some point, adaptation stops working, not suddenly. Gradually, effort increases, but outcomes flatten. They are doing more for less. And this realization creates a subtle but powerful shift in behavior. People stop trusting the rules, not openly, quietly. This is where optimization begins. Optimization is when people stop playing the game as it was intended and start playing it as it is. They stop caring about fairness. Because fairness no longer pays, they stop caring about long-term rewards. Because long-term rewards no longer feel real, they start asking different questions. Where's the leverage? What can I extract? What can I avoid? This is not moral failure. It is rational behavior inside a system that no longer works. People speculate instead of produce. They trade instead of build. They seek speed instead of stability. Short-term gains replace long-term value. And this change is contagious. Once enough people behave this way, the system itself begins to change character. It stops rewarding contribution. It starts rewarding positioning. At this stage, trust begins to fracture, not collapse, fracture. People still comply with rules, but they no longer believe in them. They still participate, but only because they have to. Belief disappears first. Compliance follows later. This distinction matters. Because belief is what holds complex systems together. Rules alone are never enough. When belief fades, coordination weakens. People stop acting in sync. They stop thinking collectively. They stop sacrificing for shared outcomes. They become individually rational and systemically destructive. This is when institutions begin to hollow out. They still exist. They still function. But they no longer inspire confidence. Processes slow. Decisions become cautious. Innovation disappears. Everything becomes risk-averse. Late-stage systems feel heavy, not because they lack power, but because every action requires justification. Every decision requires permission. Every mistake requires explanation. This is when leaders begin to sense something is wrong, but they misdiagnose the problem, they assume the issue is messaging, or morale, or perception, so they respond with reassurance. They emphasize stability, they highlight positive metrics, they promise reform, but reassurance cannot replace trust. And people can feel when words no longer match reality. The gap between experience and explanation widens, and that gap creates disengagement, not protest, disengagement. People stop expecting the system to work. They stop planning far ahead. They stop trusting institutions. They stop believing effort will be rewarded. They show up, but they do not commit. This is devastating, because complex systems require commitment. They require people to believe tomorrow matters. Once that belief disappears, everything slows, not because people are lazy, but because they are uncertain. Uncertainty kills momentum, and systems built on momentum begin to decay. At this point, instability starts to feel normal. People recalibrate expectations. They redefine success. They lower standards. They accept outcomes that would have once been unacceptable. And they say something incredibly dangerous. This is just how things are now. That sentence marks a psychological collapse, because once instability is normalized, the system no longer feels broken. It feels permanent. And permanent problems stop being questioned. Now the system enters its most deceptive phase, normalization. The system still doesn't work, but people are used to it. They no longer remember what working felt like. This is how systems survive long after they stop functioning, by lowering the bar, by exhausting resistance, by turning dysfunction into routine. At this stage, people split. Some withdraw completely. They disengage emotionally. They stop caring. They stop participating beyond necessity. Others move in the opposite direction. They demand control. They demand certainty. They demand order. And this is when systems begin to harden. Rules tighten. Flexibility disappears. Everything becomes about enforcement, not improvement. Order replaces progress, because order feels safer than uncertainty. Even when it destroys creativity, even when it kills innovation, even when it suffocates trust. This is where part one ends, not with collapse, but with exhaustion, with quiet withdrawal, with normalization of dysfunction, with a system that still exists, but no longer serves. After normalization, something subtle but irreversible happens. People stop expecting improvement, not consciously, not explicitly. They simply stop believing that things can get better. This is the moment the system truly loses its future, because the future only exists as long as people believe in it. When people believe tomorrow will be better than today, they invest, they plan, they sacrifice, they cooperate. But when that belief disappears, behavior changes at a deep instinctive level. People stop thinking in years. They stop thinking in months. They start thinking in days, sometimes in hours. The future collapses inward. And when the future collapses inward, systems unravel. This is when fear quietly replaces hope, not panic. Fear is far more effective than panic. Panic is loud and short-lived. Fear is silent and permanent. Fear reshapes priorities. It narrows focus. It makes people conservative, defensive, and inward-looking. At first, fear feels like caution. People say they are being realistic. They say they are being careful. They say they are being responsible. But fear does not create stability. It creates rigidity. And rigid systems break faster than flexible ones. As fear spreads, people begin demanding certainty, not improvement. Certainty. They want rules, clear boundaries, predictable outcomes. They are no longer asking whether the system is fair. They're asking whether it is firm. This is the moment when control begins to feel comforting, even to people who once opposed it. Because control promises one thing above all else: order. Order feels safe when everything else feels uncertain. So systems respond accordingly. They harden. Flexibility disappears. Exceptions vanish. Everything becomes standardized, centralized, enforced. The system stops pretending to serve. It starts insisting on obedience. This is a crucial transition, because systems that serve people rely on trust. Systems that control people rely on fear. And fear is easier to maintain in the short term, but infinitely more destructive in the long term. As systems harden, creativity dies. Innovation slows. Risk-taking disappears. People stop experimenting. They stop imagining alternatives, because alternatives feel dangerous, unfamiliar, risky. The system begins to look stable from the outside, orderly, quiet. But internally, it is suffocating. This is when stagnation becomes obvious, not as collapse, as heaviness. Everything takes longer. Everything costs more. Every decision feels bureaucratic. Every process feels exhausting. And no one can clearly explain why. This is because the system is no longer evolving. It is only maintaining. Maintenance consumes enormous energy, and maintenance produces nothing new. Eventually, Maintenance becomes the entire purpose of the system. Keeping things from falling apart replaces building anything meaningful. At this stage, participation becomes performative. People show up, they comply, they follow procedures, but they do not engage. They do not care. They do not believe. And belief cannot be commanded. This is when legitimacy collapses, not in headlines, but in behavior. People follow rules only when watched. They respect institutions only when forced. They stop internalizing norms. And once norms disappear, enforcement must increase. This creates a vicious cycle. More enforcement leads to more resentment. More resentment leads to more withdrawal. More withdrawal leads to more control. And more control accelerates decay, because control cannot replace trust. It can only delay the consequences of losing it. Eventually, fear begins to exhaust itself. People cannot live indefinitely in a state of tension, so they detach. They disengage. They retreat into private worlds. They stop caring about collective outcomes. This is when the system begins to lose cohesion. Cohesion is what allows complex structures to function. Without it, systems fragment. Different groups stop understanding each other. Shared reality dissolves. Everyone experiences the system differently, and when shared reality disappears, coordination becomes impossible. At this point, the system is no longer held together by belief, fear, or trust. It is held together by inertia, by habit, by the fact that it is still standing. But inertia is not strength. It is momentum without direction, and momentum eventually runs out. When inertia fades, collapse accelerates. Not dramatically, structurally. Processes stop working, supply chains falter, institutions hesitate, rules contradict each other, decisions are delayed. Nothing moves smoothly anymore. This is when people start saying things like, "It feels like everything is breaking at once," but nothing broke at once. Everything broke earlier. What they are experiencing now is exposure. The system is no longer able to hide its weaknesses, because there is no energy left to maintain the illusion. This is the phase history remembers as collapse. But collapse is not an event. It is the visible phase of a long psychological and behavioral process, a process driven by human adaptation, human denial, human fear, human exhaustion. At this point, people often look for villains. They blame leaders, they blame institutions, they blame groups. But systems do not fail because of villains. They fail because incentives stop working, because belief erodes, because trust disappears, because coordination collapses. No one is in charge of this process. No one controls it. Everyone participates in it, usually without realizing it. This is why collapse feels confusing. There is no single cause, no single moment, just a gradual unraveling, a series of reasonable responses to an unreasonable system. People adapted, they optimized, they withdrew, they normalized, they demanded control. And eventually, there was nothing left holding the structure together. Understanding this matters, not because it tells you what will happen next, but because it explains what you are seeing, why behavior feels different, why people feel tense, why institutions feel hollow, why effort feels unrewarded, why everything feels heavier than it should. This channel exists to explain those shifts, to map the invisible transitions, to show how systems fail long before collapse becomes obvious. If you understand the process, you stop being surprised. And when you stop being surprised, you stop being reactive. Subscribe if you want to understand how systems actually end, not through explosions, but through exhaustion. Because the most important moment in any system's life is not collapse. It is the moment people stop believing the future exists. And once that happens, everything else is just momentum.